And let me just say a few words that, you know, the first thing that when I planned this conference, I had to have an idea who I wanted to be here for this conference. And Heinz, please, this is not a lie. This is honestly the truth. This was the first name. I knew from the start that we had to have Heinz Ickstadt here. Heinz Ickstadt is God in Europe. He is the doyen of American studies in Europe. He is the former president of the European Association for American Studies, but he's also a friend of myself and a friend of Poland, right? Heinz has been here many times, participated in many projects, and he has helped many of us as scholars, as people. So, Heinz, please come over, welcome, and let's begin the first presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Jurek, for this, overpraise. I felt very honored by your invitation, and I'm happy to be here. Seeing so many old friends, as you suggested, I have been coming to Poland, I don't know, I think at least for 20 years, and to Lublin once before. But we went to Puławy quite often. Oh, I shouldn't turn around. Yes. Okay, I'll try my best, and I hope I won't bore you too much. And my topic is there, I don't have to repeat it. The attempt to match America's newly won political autonomy with the achievement of its cultural independence goes back to the first half of the 19th century, to the literature of the American Renaissance and the paintings of the Hudson River School. During the post-Civil War period, it shifts topically and geographically from New England westward to the Rocky Mountains, but then re-emerges in the dynamics of metropolitan New York during the first decade of the 20th century. On the one hand, this renewed urge for cultural reassertion is part of America's self-awareness as a rapidly modernizing nation. Yet on the other, it is linked to the radical break with aesthetic conventions that transformed European art, an effort, as William Homer remarked in his book on Alfred Stieglitz and his circle, to recast the visual language of European modernism in an American mold. Okay. Although the discourse of cultural independence can therefore not be separated from the emergence of the United States as a major industrial and a new imperial power, it may yet be seen as a quasi-post-colonial effort to create a distinctly American literature and art against the cultural dominance of Europe. Absorbing the new techniques of European modernism, while at the same time trying to be different from it, American modernists of the 1910s and 1920s, especially the painters and writers associated with the Stieglitz circle, discovered in their own usable past in Emerson's, Thoreau's, and Whitman's search for the presence of God, as well as of the national spirit, in the sublimity of nature, as did the landscape painters of that period when they explored the terror and the beauty of its wilderness. The most distinctive and perhaps the most impressive characteristic of American scenery is its wildness, Thomas Cole had famously argued in 1836, the year Emerson published Nature. And 10 years later, after an excursion to Mount Katahdin, Thoreau wrote in awe of nature's grim sublimity, "We have not seen pure nature unless we have seen her thus vast and dreary and inhuman. Nature was here something savage and awful, though beautiful." The awareness of early American modernists of the artistic revolutions that were going on in Paris, Berlin, or Milan went hand in hand with their discovery of American ancestries and continuities, the perception of spirituality in the material world as expressed in the writings of the Transcendentalists, as well as in the Transcendentalist paintings of the mid and late 19th century, in their creation of what one critic called a national landscape. If Asher B. Durant had warned his fellow artists that the creation of such a landscape would only be possible if they looked at the natural world and not at pictures, his modernist successors did both. Most of them looked first at nature, then studied the techniques of European experimental painters, before they eventually came back to nature, but now exploring it with different eyes and with new tools of expression or representation. I shall concentrate on a number of that landscape's iconic objects, as they are represented in literature and painting, such as Mount Katahdin, climbed and described by Thoreau, painted by Frederick Church, among others, and then again several generations later by Marston Hartley, or the New England coast of Maine and Cape Cod, which Thoreau explored and wrote about in great detail, and that Winslow Homer, John Marin, and Marston Hartley painted obsessively. But there is also a short phase in the 1920s during which the national landscape is extended and nature replaced by a man-made, yet equally sublime second nature, the city, Manhattan, its skyscrapers and bridges, most of all Brooklyn Bridge, the central image of a new urban iconography. In the beauty of the bridge, John Marin, Joseph Stella, and the poet Hart Crane ecstatically revealed the continuing presence of divinity, thus rephrasing the discourse of the natural sublime in urban terms, until that discourse collapsed in the 30s, and American art, or the American in art, was redefined as regional and local, and once again centered in nature. Sorry about this. In what follows, I shall try to construct a narrative that will focus on Mount Katahdin, Brooklyn Bridge, and the sea, as well as on real and imaginary dialogues between poets and painters within and across generations, between Thoreau and Hartley, Stella and Crane, between Hartley, Crane, and William Carlos Williams, but also on the tensions in the concept of the creative self and the quality and function of its vision. Alfred Stieglitz, famous photographer, gallerist, and editor of the art journal Camera Work, was the charismatic mentor of a small group of New York artists, and he made it the mission of his life to enlighten the American public in matters of art, to introduce it to the path-breaking achievements of European modernism, and help develop an art that would be at once modernist and unmistakably American. Between 1908 and 1913, the year of the Armory Show, his Gallery 291 was not only the first in the US to exhibit paintings and sculptures of Matisse, Cézanne, and Picasso. It was also the only place at that time where the artists of an emerging American avant-garde had the chance to present their works. In many cases, Stieglitz helped them to survive financially by arranging exhibitions for them, buying their pictures, or making his friends buy them. 291 preceded and also anticipated the Armory Show. Although Stieglitz was not involved in its organization, the show seemed to confirm and move forward his agenda to enlighten the American public in matters of art. Yet it also undermined its status as a unique and pioneering place. In the wake of the Armory Show, new galleries and art journals were founded, and with them new centers for the avant-garde. The circle that Walter and Louise Arnsberg formed in 1915 attracted a younger group of immigrant Dadaists and futurists, most famous among them Marcel Duchamp, freshly arrived from France, and Francis Pigabia, to whom Stieglitz, with his faith in the sacredness of art, appeared venerable, if somewhat old-fashioned. When 291 had to close in 1917, the dynamics of avant-garde activities shifted toward the Arnsbergs. After they left New York in the early 20s, Stieglitz again opened a new gallery, first the Intimate Place and later the American Place, both frequented by his old 291 protégés, but also by newcomers and those who had been drifting between 291 and the Arensberg Circle, Joseph Stella, Charles Demuth, Marston Hartley, and Charles Sheeler, or the poets William Carlos Williams and Hart Crane. Although the artistic concept of both groups, the recently arrived Dadaist futurists and Stieglitz's homegrown neo-transcendentalists, differed considerably, there were also overlaps that made such drifting plausible. Both aimed at the creation of a distinctly American art, which in the case of the Arensberg Circle included the products of industrial America and its commercial culture, a culture that Stieglitz despised deeply. In their artistic endeavors, both evoked the spirit of Walt Whitman, the indigenous patron saint of the American modern, the rock, as Williams wrote, on which we all built. I shall concentrate on Marin, Stella, Hartley, and their literary counterparts, Crane and Williams, not least because the three painters were also ambitious writers. Hartley calling himself a painter and a poet, Martin enacting in his wonderful letters a whimsical Huck-Finn version of Thoreau, Stella projecting ecstatic futurist visions in the voice of Whitman. Stieglitz had met Marin in Paris in 1909 and was so taken with him and his work that he invited him to exhibit at 291 a year later. He considered Marin his closest artist friend and most dedicated follower. Their personal affinity is echoed in their work. Stieglitz in photography and Marin in his watercolors oscillate between a commitment to city and to nature, intending to reveal America's spiritual essence, its true significance in both. After his return from Europe, Marin responded ecstatically to the explosive energy of New York City, piling New York's great houses one upon another with paint, as they do pile themselves up there, so beautiful, so fantastic. At times, one is afraid to look at them, but feels like running away, which is an adaptation of the rhetoric of the Sublime to the urban scene. There is a line-dissolving energy in the thrust upward toward where the building's tops seems to touch the sun in this picture. Or is it that the chaos of horizontal and diagonal lines in the foreground is gathered and ordered in the upward push of the building? At the same time, the structure of urban phenomena appears to be conflated with the natural architecture of a mountain landscape, its rock-like formations, its arrangement of lateral and vertical lines. Although the painting is very clearly representational, anchored in the perception of a well-known object, the Wordsworth building, the Woolworth building, of course, the perceiving subject is present in the dynamics of the representation, or rather, what is being represented is the dynamics, the energy inherent in the perceived object, as well as in the perceiving subject. The emotional energy of the one echoed in the dance-like movement of the other, in the awareness of a general fluidity of things, for which watercolors seem to be the perfect medium of expression. Shall we consider the life of the great city as confined simply to the people and animals on its streets and in its buildings? Marin wrote in the catalogue of his New York exhibition of 1913. Are the buildings themselves dead? If these buildings move me, they too must have life. Thus, the whole city is alive. Buildings, people, all are alive. And the more they move me, the more I feel them to be alive. While these powers are at work, pushing, pulling, sideways, downwards, upwards, I can hear the sound of their strife, and there's great music being played. And so I try to express graphically what a great city is doing. Within the frames, there must be a balance, a controlling of these warring, pushing, pulling forces. That is what I'm trying to realize. The expression Marin gave to life in things, as much as to the life of things, was what he called their movement and their inner music. Go to look at the bird's flight. he advised his fellow painters. The man's walk, the sea's movement, they have a way to keep the motion. Nature's laws of motion have to be obeyed, and you have to follow along. This was very much the painter's job, that lusty desire to splash about, submerge oneself in a medium. Piling New York's great houses one upon another with paint involved a constructive process of its own that connected in Emersonian triangulation the creative work of the artist with that of the city architect, and both with the constructive processes of nature. I refer to weight balances. As my body exerts a downward pressure on the floor in turn exerts an upward pressure on my body. 2, the pressure of the air against my body against the air. All this I have to recognize when building the picture. This underlying principle of construction, that also is a form of organic growth, this wedding of man and nature, this merger with the world was, as he argued, the basis of his art. It's a question as to whether the open sight vision, that is, of things you see, isn't better than the inner vision of things. My answer now to myself is that you cannot divorce the two. They are inseparable. They go together. The inner picture being a composite of things seen with the eye, the art object being neither the one or the other, but a separate thing in itself. It makes Marin what I would call a transcendentalist modernist, rooted in a world seen with and through the eye, spiritual essences revealed in material surfaces, or inversely, the object perceived gaining true reality by its subjective transformation via modernist abstraction into an aesthetic object. Joseph Steller, who had come to New York shortly after Marin's return from Europe, brought with him from Paris fresh memories of a sensational exhibition of Italian futurists in 1912. His Battle of Lights, Coney Island, 1913-1914, made him famous and established him as the most radical, next to Duchamp, of American avant-gardists. Steller had come to the States for the first time in 1896, when he was barely 19 and became illustrator for several magazines of social reform. He returned to Italy in 1909, but 4 years later decided to try his luck a second time and went back to New York, his ears probably still ringing from futurist manifestos proclaiming New York City as the avatar of a new civilization. Equally important for Steller, writes Barbara Haskell, was Picabbia's endless proselytizing on the beauty and dynamism of New York. You of New York should be quick to understand me and my fellow painters. Your New York is Cubist, the futurist city. It expresses its architecture, its life, its spirit, the modern thought. You have passed through all the old schools and are futurists in word, deed, and thought. Steller started painting Brooklyn Bridge in 1918, the picture you saw before, and then a year or two later, the voice of the city of New York interpreted his 5-panel vision of New York that celebrated the city as the shrine containing all the efforts of the new civilization of America, the eloquent meeting of all forces arising in superb assertion of their powers in apotheosis. I'm very sorry for this picture. It was the only way to get 5 panels next to each other. You'll get a closer look into some sections. At almost the same time, Charles Sheeler and Paul Strand, both members of the Stieglitz Circle, created a film that proclaimed the New York's mythic status as gigantic machine and second nature. Manhattan, become booming with vertical energy and the horizontal movement of its human masses, but also embedded in nature and its cycles, its rhythms marked by the movement of the tides and of the sun. Although Steller, like Marin or Sheila Strand, invoked Whitman as a visionary guide, he yet seems to have severed his constructivist city from organic ties to nature or to self. It is perhaps for this reason that Marin dispensed with Stella's masterpiece as not having anything of the real bridge feeling in it, and any more than if he had put up some street cables and things in his studio, painted a rather beautiful thing, and called it the bridge, which again, to me at least, is just what he did. What Marin may have had in mind is the lack in Stella's painting of what Stieglitz called expression of life, the felt subjective response to the object grasped in the act of perception. If compared to Marin's Brooklyn Bridge, Stella's futurist version appears to be curiously static, despite its vertical thrust, highly theatrical, staged, symphonic, symbolically arranged, a visionary statement of faith, like the glass windows of a cathedral, or the altarpiece of a new religion of technology and capital. Both panels clearly project a symbolic urban landscape, although some of the skyscrapers may be identified, like in the center, the Woolworth building, and the Flatiron building further down. The ensemble is not seen, but constructed, composed. Barbara Haskell perceives in the voice of the city of New York interpreted a literary quality absent from other paintings of the city. This may be in response to the narrative implied in the arrangement of the panels, as well as in their symbolic structure. You enter the city via the harbor on the right, then encounter the dazzling lights of Broadway, the White Way, panel 2 and 4. These two panels frame the center of power, the skyscrapers, until at last the bridge guides the viewer's eye beyond, upward, beyond. But Haskell's perception of literariness may also be a response to the extraordinary text that Stella wrote 10 years later, 10 years after his painting. Brooklyn Bridge, A Page of My Life, 1928, is a synesthetic poem en prose, a mystic and myth-making piece of writing whose only equivalent in the literature of the period can be found in the exalted rhetoric of Atlantis, the climactic poem of Hart Crane's own mythopoetic celebration of Brooklyn Bridge. For what Stella's text does, and what his painting does not, is to introduce and explain a subject position, the position of the observer or the lyrical eye, analogous to that of Crane's in his introductory poem to Brooklyn Bridge. Under thy shadow by the piers I waited. Only in darkness is thy shadow clear. Brooklyn Bridge had become an ever-growing obsession ever since I had come to America, thus Stella. Many nights I stood on the bridge, and in the middle alone, lost, a defenseless prey to the surrounding swarming darkness, crushed by the mountainous black impenetrability of the skyscrapers. Here and there lights resembling the suspended falls of astral bodies or fantastic splendors of remote cities. Shaken by the underground tumult of the trains in perpetual motion, like the blood in the arteries, at times ringing as alarm in a tempest, the shrill, sulphurous voice of the trolley wires, now and then strange moanings of appeal from tugboats, guessed more than seen through the infernal recesses below, I felt deeply moved, as if on the threshold of a new religion or in the presence of a new divinity. At the end, brusquely, a new light broke over me, metamorphosing aspects and visions of things. Unexpectedly, from the sudden unfolding of blue distances of my youth in Italy, a great clarity announced peace, proclaiming the luminous dawn of a new era. Stella's interpretation of his painting reveals the inward drama hidden in or behind the vision he projected outward, the lost and isolated self, overcoming its isolation by taking symbolic possession of the powers that crush it, the mountainous black impenetrability of the skyscrapers, and in doing so becomes ecstatically aware of a new self embodied in Brooklyn Bridge, that is also a bridge of reconciliation between a lost youth in Italy and a luminous future in America. By interpreting New York, Stella has found his place and a self that is finally sure where it belongs. It is impossible to know whether Crane saw Stella's painting or read his text before he finished his own cyclic poem. He was in any case instrumental in having Stella's prose poem republished in Eugene Jolas's journal Transition in 1929. In a letter to Stella, Crane wrote, "It is a remarkable coincidence that I should, years later, have discovered that another person, by whom I mean you, should have had the same sentiments regarding Brooklyn Bridge, which inspired the main theme and pattern of my poem. It is indeed the recognition of a kindred spirit, and for Crane a sure sign of a new order of consciousness, whose coming, he felt, had been prophetically announced by Alfred Stieglitz and by Waldo Frank, the philosopher and cultural critic, and now confirmed by artists like Stella and himself." However, when his poem was at last published in 1930, Crane had lost faith in his vision as much as in his own creative powers. Whatever spirituality he might once have seen embodied in it, Brooklyn Bridge appeared to be no more now than an economic approach to shorter hours and quicker lunches. Yet what he took to be his failure as a visionary poet cannot be separated from the general disillusion with the promise of the urban sublime at the beginning of the 30s. The mirage of the city scene, as if for the first time, Fitzgerald addressed it in The Great Gatsby, and then again in My Lost City in 1932. And another Italian immigrant painter, Luis Guglielmi, gave expression to it in his surreal mental geography of 1938, which is actually painted in colors, but I have only that reproduction. Stella himself, however, clung to his utopian vision till the very end of his life, painting time and again the bridge that had made his career and embodied his American identity. Yet the time for discovering spiritual wholeness in the surging city was clearly over. Marston Hartley painted his own urban ecstasies away from New York in another metropolitan center of modernism, Berlin, where he spent several years before and during World War I. Hartley relished Berlin's ultra-modernity, writes Edyta Frelik, from whom I learned a lot about Hartley, combined with its carnivalesque excess and intense decadence, both public and private. In a letter to Stein, I'm still quoting, he describes the city as an interesting source of materials, numbers and shapes and colors that make one wonder, big lines and large masses. It is, if you compare these with the New York paintings, it's of course a totally different rendition of the city. For him, for Hartley, it was a tension, a structural tension between colors and visual structures. At the same time, the city was very much connected with one person, his lover, von Freiburg. But then he has another painting of Berlin. It's called Berlin Anti-War, which is actually more his vision of Germany than of Berlin. You have at the bottom certain emblems of rural Germany. Then above that, the Prussian cavalry, again, it's von Freiburg. But at the same time, it is the Blaue Reiter, the famous group with Franz Marc and Kandinsky, with whom Hartley was associated. Above that, the unicorn, always a symbol of the imagination. And above that unicorn, at least several versions of the blue flower, die blaue Blume of German Romanticism, as we know it from Novalis. However, the Berlin paintings Hartley brought back to New York, still considered by some critics his best work, were not well received, since they seemed to document Hartley's cultural allegiance to the German enemy. Stieglitz admonished him to find a place and identity in America, which Hartley tried, but found difficult to do, and therefore continued for the next 15 years to travel between styles, regions, and continents, much to Stieglitz's displeasure. Hartley knew Hart Crane from 291 and as a one-time neighbor in Brooklyn, although they lived there at different times in the same building. And actually, there was a time when Hartley, Hart Crane, and Dos Passos lived in the same building on the facing Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan skyline. They met again in Marseille in 1929 when the bridge was still in print, and then again a few years later in Mexico, Crane spending there the last month of a Guggenheim Fellowship, Hartley the first of his own. Both shared a fascination with the visionary and occult, William Blake being their favorite poets. And they were homosexuals, Crane aggressively flaunting it, at times at least, while Hartley tried to disguise it. Note how in his self-portrait, Hartley called it sustained comedy, the painter's self-deprecating clown image nevertheless asserts his visionary power. The arrows that pierce his clairvoyant blue eyes may bring suffering, but also generate butterflies, symbols of immortality. The lightning stroke of intuition marks his forehead. Birds nest on one of the shoulders of this modern-day St. Francis, St. Sebastian, while the other sprouts a bunch of flowers. The themes of suffering, pain, and mysticism that are leitmotifs in Hartley's paintings tempt me to compare Hartley's self-portrait with Crane's self-revelatory poem, Possessions, although Crane's intensities lack the ironic self-reflexivity that marks Hartley's work. I just read the last stanza of Crane's poem. Tossed on these horns, who bleeding dies, lacks all but piteous admissions to be spilled upon the page, whose blind sum finally burns a record of rage and partial appetites. The pure possession, the inclusive cloud whose heart is fire, shall come. The white wind raise all but bright stones wherein our smiling plays. Hartley was devastated when he heard that Crane had committed suicide by jumping overboard the steamer Orizaba on his way back from Mexico on April 27, 1932. Hartley himself had toyed with the idea of suicide, despairing of his isolation, as well as of his lack of recognition and of money. Crane had told him that after the failure of the bridge, he had nothing more to say, which horrified Hartley. Hart had not done his work because he saw in Crane a younger alter ego and thus an image of his own possible defeat. He wrote 3 essays on Crane, published a lengthy commemorative poem, Un recuerdo hermano, Hart Crane, R.I.P., and painted 8 bells folly in memory of him. The essays, all of them unpublished, mainly underline their difference of character, as if Hartley wanted to assure himself that Crane's fate would never be his. Nevertheless, there is a deep sense of personal loss which has echoes in the poem. I just read certain sections, it's about 5 pages long. And should it be left like this, dear heart, like this, too much fulfillment, no more promise, given over petulantly, fevered, you the severing, we the severed, to wind wash, wave flow, wave toss and thrash, beating forward, backward, to and fro in the unremitting high and low, in the ever never-ending torment of today, yesterday, so redolent of geniality, never again to know tomorrow. A beautiful dive, then floating on his back, waved a hand and was seen no more. Gone to the end of the bridge and over, worn with roving the bridge rover, done with all the walking and the stalking and all the cheap talking. These excerpts may represent the uncertainty of Hartley's verse, its wavering between the elevated and the trivial, especially with regard to rhyme and verbal choice. Yet the poem clearly tries to render rhythmically the sea swell of Crane's post-mortem existence, an everlasting being in not being, as Hartley had written in one of these Crane essays. In addition, Hartley wove into the texture of his poem images and motifs of Crane's poetry. Crane had written several sea poems, most memorably at Melville's Tomb and Voyages, where the sea became a symbol for the dissolution of the self in love, just as in the end he made the sea the medium of his own dissolution in death. No wonder then that Hartley painted the sea in Eight Bells' Folly as a portrait of Crane's being in not being, as living after having suffered a sea change. Accordingly, the painting is highly symbolic and has, as Hartley stated, a mad look. The madness, the folly, was Crane's in his dying as well as in the frantic intensity of his living. In the poem, Hartley had integrated elements of what had already become part of Crane's legend. Eyewitnesses on board the ship had seen Crane come up to the surface for a last time, then floating on his back, waved a hand and was seen no more. Hartley also included the shark that others believed to have seen shortly after Crane jumped. The clipper sailing through the dark sea toward a horizon lit by the moon and sun, or is it the golden apple of heavenly perfection, may symbolize Crane's and Hartley's lifelong yearning for a beyond, still one shore beyond desire, as Crane had written in Ave Maria. The number 33 on its sails marks Crane's and Christ's age when he died. The 8 refers to 8 bells, or noon, the hour of Crane's suicide. Yet like the number 9, the 8 may also associate infinity and immortality. And around the bell, on the right, explains Hartley in a letter to his niece, are a lot of men's eyes that look up from below to see who the new lodger is to be. Hartley painted several elegies in his life. The first in commemoration of his German lover Karl von Freiburg, who was killed during the first weeks of World War I. His death made Hartley paint Portrait of a German Officer, which combines an abstract cubist arrangement of the officer's insignia and uniform with symbols of their friendship. The number 24 referring to Freiburg's age at the time of his death, the number 4 to his regiment. Eight Bells' Folly is situated between this earlier abstract portrait and a commemoration 5 years later, 1937, of 2 Nova Scotia fishermen whom Hartley had loved, whom he now intensely mourned. They had drowned in 1936 at night during a fierce storm when they tried to get home from a fishing trip. His northern seascape off the banks where they had died is more representational than both of his previous elegies. It also evokes in his realism and its stylization of waves, rocks, and clouds 2 painters Hartley greatly admired, Winslow Homer, the realist, and Albert Pinkham Ryder, the painter of the dreamlike and mysterious. The symbolism is thus more discreet than in Eight Bells. The 2 sails, the 2 sailing boats scudding toward the horizon may evoke the souls of the drowned fishermen, but then may also be just boats on a rough sea. In northern seascapes, the rocks, like sharks' teeth, are reminders of the sea's power of death and destruction. There's a Melvillian sense of nature's savage sublimity that informs Homer's sea paintings as well as Thoreau's description of Mount Katahdin and Cape Cod. Hartley gave expression to it in another elegiac poem and painting, both called Fisherman's Last Supper. For wine they drank the ocean. For bread they ate their own despairs. Counsel from the moon was theirs for the foolish contention. And in another poem, he emphasized the seductive, destructive beauty of the sea. When the surf licking with its tongues these volcanic personal shapes, which we're defining for ourselves as rocks, accept them as such at its feverish incoming, isn't it too in its way something like the plain image of life, those restless entities disturbing solid substances with curious, irrelevant, common thread? And like so many simple-looking elements, when they seem most playful, it is then that they are most dangerous. For many have been sent to their death, trusting too much while regarding it affectionately, the sea. All of Hartley's elegies, painted or written, deal with the tragic loss in his life. But in each case, they also mark his overcoming despair by creative self-assertion and a new phase in his development as painter. Throughout his career, he had wavered between expressing emotional intensity through abstract expression and a vehement rejection of the subjective, the annihilation of self in the object, something he admired in Cézanne. To have an eye with a brain in it, he wished for in 1919, and in an essay of 1928, he went even further in his rejection of the emotionally expressive. I have joined once and for all the ranks of the intellectual experimentalists, possibly thinking of Picabia and Duchamp. I can hardly bear the sound of the words expressionism, emotionalism, personality. I no longer believe in the imagination. Yet in response to the deep shock caused by Crane's death, Hartley began to artistically reinvent himself. In working through an artist's death, Hartley discovered his own subject matter, thus Jonathan Weinberg. Another critic argues that Eight Bells' Folly was Hartley's first overt inclusion of a personal reference in his art since his German days in the 1910s, and a sign that Hartley had begun to reinstate the subjective, the mystic, and imaginative. My pictures are bound to the mystical more and more, for that is what I myself am more and more, he wrote in 1933. I belong naturally to the Emerson Thoreau tradition, and I know that too well. It is my native substance. He now proclaims immersion in a mysticism of nature that fused subject and object in the act of imaginative seeing. The power to see clearly, it is what the artist has with his eye, the power to observe the rhythmic order of the universe. This dichotomy in Hartley's aesthetic theory and practice between expression of self and the dissolution of self in the object it perceives finds an interesting parallel in Hart Crane's and William Carlos Williams' diverging concepts of the visionary eye, even though, as is apparent in Crane's The Bridge and Williams's In the American Grain, they were both committed to the vision of another America, rooted in the act of seeing and in myth. Crane believed that the dynamic curve of the bridge, as much as the dynamics of his own metaphoric densities, were both evidence of his visionary experience of knowledge, were incarnations, the word made flesh in steel, stone, and metaphor, of an invisible but all-pervasive creative energy. And yet, at the time when Hartley began writing his commemorative poem, Williams published a merciless review of Crane's poetry, denouncing its failure of word and vision. His eyes seemed to me often to have been blurred by vision, when they should have been held hard as he could hold them, on the object. Whereas in Crane's eyes, the bridge, like a Stieglitz snapshot, was movement caught and turned into timeless presence, the moment made eternal. For Williams, timelessness was in the experiential process. In his aesthetics of immanence, presence meant constant attention toward an ever-changing now of experience that for each moment had to be caught and represented anew. Yet when Hartley met Crane in Mexico, Crane's poetic practice had taken a turn of which neither Williams nor Hartley were aware. In his last poem, The Broken Tower, the only poem he had written during his year in Mexico, as Hartley noted disapprovingly. Crane seems to revoke his earlier visionary poetics when he asks the poet to lift down the eye. It is the reversal of an earlier metaphor he had used in At Melville's Tomb, eyes there were that lifted altars, where God is made to exist by the very desire for his existence. Crane was not able to test the implications of this downward vision, but one may well speculate that it would have been close to Williams's insistence on holding the eye close to the object. It might also have found an echo in Hartley's paintings of the 30s and early 40s, which gave evidence of his eye lifted down in a precise, if condensed, representation of things seen. What moves Hartley even closer to Williams is the fact that his reorientation of the eye coincides with his homecoming, the cosmopolitan wanderer between continents, not only returning to his native land, something Stieglitz had begged him to do for decades, but to his native region, Maine. No wonder that Williams, the champion of an American literature rooted in the local, praised Hartley in an unpublished review of a 1940 exhibition of Hartley's paintings. Hartley is painting better today than he ever could have hoped to do formerly, and the reason becomes more and more apparent. It is a painter's reason, a basic reason. It has to do with the mind, the body, and the spirit drawn gradually together into one life, and finally flowering once. The gnarledest of paintings can emit pure light when they finally come through, when they make good, when they close up a broken life, such as American, as Hartley must have led to bring into place his native completion. Williams's intense localism may seem like a far cry from Stieglitz's idea of the artist's involvement in the shaping of an America still in the making. But it was Hartley himself who believed that his homecoming was indeed a completion, giving him place, identity, and not least the recognition he had long craved for. It is a smiling festival when rock, juniper, and wind are of one mind. A seagull signs the bond, makes what was broken whole. He wrote in a poem called The Return of the Native, and in a picture, I think, which is called Give Us This Day. Cassidy and others have demonstrated that this return home was also a retreat from those forces of modernity that Crane had hoped to integrate in his own mythic vision of America. It was a retreat from a commercial urban culture to the spirituality of New England, even though Hartley did not mind at all profiting commercially from his new status as Maine's most prominent painter. It was a retreat also to what he considered the purer and simpler life of farmers and fishermen, and, alas, to what he took to be the racial purity of Anglo-Saxondom. Going home to come into his own also meant to retake possession of what he considered his by right of birth and artistic ancestry, the landscape of New England and the aesthetic tradition of writers and painters that had elevated its sites to national icons. I returned to my tall timbers and my granite cliffs because in them rests the kind of integrity I believe in, and from which source I draw my private strength spiritually and aesthetically. In September 1939, he wrote to a friend, "Next month, I go up Mount Katahdin to paint the sacred mountain. And I must put myself on record as having done this. And as far as I know, it has never appeared in art. I have elected myself official portrait painter. I must get that mount for future reason of fame and success." It is, of course, quite unlikely that Hartley would not have known that Frederick Church had been as much obsessed with Mount Katahdin as he was now, almost 90 years later, that in fact they shared a veritable mountain madness. This is Church again. It's a pastoral version of a wild mountain The wildness of that mountain he caught in a sketch, which he never converted into a painting. And then, of course, Hartley again. Hartley's pilgrimage made him paint 18 portraits, as he called them, of Mount Katahdin, since climbing the mountain had been nothing less than a religious experience for him. I know I have seen God now, he confessed to a friend. The occult connection that is established when one loves nature was complete, and so I felt transported to a visible fourth dimension. And since heaven is inviolably a state of mind, I have been there these past 10 days. Perhaps it is this sense of finally having found home that allows him in this last phase of his life, he died in 1943, to create almost crane-like a symbolic art of secular religiosity, which is nevertheless based on the concretely perceived natural object. One might even argue that Mount Katahdin is for Hartley what Brooklyn Bridge had been for Hart Crane, except that its experienced timelessness goes back to that primeval earth before man, which Thoreau had described in terms of beauty, terror, and awe. For Hartley, painting Mount Katahdin was to, as he wrote, to uncover the principle of conscious unity in all things, and to witness the living essence present everywhere, such as the unity inherent in the forms of mountain and of sea, in the wave rhythms connecting all natural phenomena. Reduced to the massive archaic blackness set against the essentialized colors of sky, blue, cloud, white, lake, blue, and autumn forest, red-orange, Hartley's Mount Katahdin is primeval and invulnerable, surviving man's savage assault on that awful though beautiful wilderness that Mount Katahdin had once embodied in the eyes of poets and landscape painters. For Hartley, it was an icon of his inmost solitary self, as well as an archetypal symbol of mystic power, forever asserting a creative energy that he himself had ecstatically experienced throughout his life, despite periods of depression and despair, so that he could write in one of his last poems, "I want nothing in the way of artificial heavens. The earth is all I know of wonder. I lived and was nurtured in the magic of dreams, bright flames of spirit laughter around all my seething frame." Thank you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate.
Yes, we have. Is this working? Okay, we have time for questions. You know, coffee is waiting for us. It will not go away. So we will deserve it even more if we spend some more time and engage in a discussion, brief discussion with Professor Ickstadt, who I think he has opened the gates. There are so many topics, subjects that you address that will be returned to in all the presentations here that I assume that most of you probably will want to say something, ask a question or make a comment, but we only have time for a few, but please go ahead. We have microphones. Can I ask my students to just try to distribute the two microphones, maybe at both ends? Professor Hemingway.
Thank you, Heinz. It was a really wonderful talk, very richly suggestive, and offers interesting overlaps with what I'm going to talk about. I was wondering about your use of the concept of the sublime and whether one can't see a certain kind of dynamic taking place, because in the 18th century, when the sublime emerges as an aesthetic category, it does so and replaces the complete dominance of beauty as an aesthetic category hitherto. And one of the things which makes Burke's philosophical inquiry such a seminal text is that for the first time you have a theorist who says that the beautiful and the sublime are antithetical, and indeed that the sublime is a more powerful emotion than the beautiful. And he also, of course, associates the sublime intrinsically with terror and with the infinite. In the dynamic of your presentation, you have a shift from where the sublime is associated with the natural world, which it is, of course, primarily for Burke and for 18th century thinkers generally, and one of the things which makes nature superior to art. You have a transition from that to it being imposed on the urban world, and particularly the world of the great metropolis. And in relation to that, you invoked the term second nature, which is a term I associate with the early Lukács and with romantic anti-capitalism.
Or with Emerson.
Yes. Well, it would be interesting to know which. But it's as if the urban world takes over the character of terror in a certain sense, and that it becomes very hard to find the beautiful in the urban world, and if anything, it has to be imposed on the urban world as a way of taming it, because the associations of second nature mean that human life itself, human activity, is out of control, that humans have created something which they can no longer bend to rational ends.
But you have that in Crane as well as in Stella, and in Marin, the combination of awe and beauty. I mean, it's as if they adopted that language of the 19th century, as we know it from Cole and from other painters, to the urban scene. At the same time, that urban scene is man-made, and that is a fundamental difference to the natural world sublimity. But Stella's prose piece is full of terror. He is forced, in a sense, to speak of an underworld, of a hellish underworld, and it is, for him, represented in the tunnel that go underneath the East River. As Crane did the same thing with the tunnel that sort of channeled his suffering from the city into the schemas of partly Christian, partly other orderings of the natural sublime. And in that sense, I mean, you're right. You cannot simply say the city sort of continues nature. It does and it doesn't, because you are part of it as you are not part of nature. But it's interesting, for example, with Cole and also with Church, the pastoral, that is the reinstatement of beauty, is inevitable because the savage landscape will be converted into a garden. That's sort of the American logic. And it was interesting to see that Church, who tried to appeal to a larger audience, did not stress the wild, the savage. He had the vision of the garden, the landscape America was going to be. But there's always an underground of fear and awe, which is in his paintings. And when you read Thoreau, he seems to almost betray his transcendentalist urge to create beauty and harmony when he goes to Mount Katahdin, or when he talks about the wreckages at Cape Cod. There is a fundamental terror that is Melvillian in some sense, I think, and which cannot be so easily reconciled with beauty. Although he says it's awful and beautiful.
I mean, the 19th century sublime, nature is divine, whereas the 20th century city is not divine.
Well, yes, true. But all of these guys speak about the divinity of the bridge or even of the skyscrapers. I mean, they represent power, which crushes you when you live in the city, but at the same time, they are a sign of men's creativity, in that sense also a product of God's creative presence in us, or something like that. At least that's the logic I see behind it.
Can I ask people asking questions to introduce themselves into the microphone so it's recorded? We can then later identify the names. Erika Doss, I can identify her.
I am Erika Doss. I'm at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you very much. That was a lovely talk, and I really appreciate the correspondence between artists and poets, particularly strongly in the teens and 20s in New York. My question is, what do you think Marsden Hartley meant when he used the word spiritual? He's constantly talking in his diaries and in his essays, and I think you have the comment, oh, there's God in that mountain. What does he mean? Because he's also very much a spiritual searcher, never quite committed to any particular religion for any long period of time. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that might be.
Well, I think you ask for a concretion that is impossible to give. I mean, you can ask the same thing of Emerson, what he means with the oversoul or whatever. It is something that is a creative energy that is visible in all things and works its way through all things, which unites man and nature to some extent, and is the wave-like structure of the universe. So you can even have associations with pragmatism, and William James, whom he read and loved as much as he loved Emerson and Thoreau. I think you can in the 1920s, all these poets, and maybe all the painters, although I know the poets better than the painters, are really, I think they believe in what Whitman had called the creative urge. They might call it eros, something that works in nature and is partly also connected with the constant processes of creativity that are going on. So I would, without really wanting to put a label on anything, because it is very much, everything is fluid and in transition, it flows, but it has tremendous energy which comes out in the objects that are represented. I'm not sure whether that answers your question. Spirituality is, of course, a very vague term, and that's maybe one of the reasons why he uses it. At the same time, I mean, pushing beyond boundaries, pushing into the mystical, into something that you know is there because you feel it, but doesn't have a name necessarily. It is a transcendence which is not God, although you may name it God occasionally without believing in a God as we know it from Catholicism or from Christianity. But some presence that you feel in your heart or wherever you feel it, that is more than the visible world, but working through it and in it. It's Emersonian, and I think he was an Emersonian.
My name is Mimi Gross. I come from New York, and I'm a painter. And I'd like to make a specific comment which adds to your essay's marvelous. It's really inspiring. I just want to make a comment about the painters you spoke about in particular, is that they not only came with new imagery, with passionate new imagery, but they each painted in their own way that didn't exist before. They had their own technique. Although they came out of the European modernists in a certain sense, they took the material and they used it differently. Marin as a watercolorist, but as a painter. Hartley in the thickness and the brightness and the simplicity of his colors, and Stella in a classic Cubist manner. I just think it's important to bring that in because they were painters.
Thank you very much. I always forget the brush strokes and the thickness of them.
That's why I'm mentioning it.
Thank
They're
you
always
very much.
forgotten.
Thank you.
One more comment, Derek.
Hi, I'm Leanne Carroll. I guess following up on that comment, I wanted to ask you more about the poets. I really enjoyed the way you've brought the poets and the painters together here. Theme being an obvious one with the Brooklyn Bridge, and the sort of biographical connections with housing and fellowships and this sort of thing. But I'm particularly interested in this idea of similar subjectivities or similar points of view or perspectives that the artists and the poets were employing. So could you tell me more about the point of view or the kind of subjectivity that Crane is using in his poems, and how that is similar to Stella? I think that was something that you
Well,
mentioned. Yeah.
yes and no. I think in the text, Stella brings in a subjective position that he leaves out of the painting. At least I felt that way. That poem I quoted from, unfortunately, only one because I didn't want to make the essay, the talk too long, was that last stanza of Possessions. Possessions is, I think, a wonderful poem. It is about what is the essence of Crane, I find. His idea that using his life as a kind of transformative experience, what he suffers and transforms into the poem, the work of art, making his own body, if you want to, like a station of transformation, converting subjective suffering into something that is objective, not objective, but an object of art, the word as incarnate incarnation of experience. In that sense, Crane is, of course, tremendously romantic. And I always envision him like a Saint Sebastian with his spears in his breast, and then or Pelican, whatever, you know, these archetypal figures, and then converts that subjectivity, that suffering, opening his breast to whatever happens in the city in order to being tortured by it and to turn that torture into the beauty of the word. That's what the poem is about. And I think that much of Hart Crane's poetry is about, which is not quite the same what Stella does. Although when you compare that text, which I quoted from, with the structure of the Crane poem, it's amazing how much of what is in one text is in the other. The same, surprisingly, you could say in The American Grain, where Crane says, that is almost what I'm trying to do in my own poem, which is something that Williams did not particularly like, because he wanted to be individually recognized and not mixed up with all these other guys. So I think I lost your question and my argument, and I hope you will forgive me. I think there is no real direct continuation of subjectivity. I think the most intense subjectivity you have in Crane. Hartley's case is a little different, although if I look at this self-portrait, you have the same kind of exposure, but with a lot of self-irony that Crane does not have. Crane has no use for self-irony. Yeah, maybe that comes from being a painter where you objectify yourself in the process of painting. I don't know. The painters among us.
Thank you very much. I think that we should not exhaust ourselves during the first session, save some energy, replenish some of that energy. So let's take the first break, and let's try to keep the schedule. You know what the program of the conference is, and in each session we have a designated moderator for the session. So I expect that having introduced Heinz to this wonderful session, we will have subsequent sessions that will be as exciting, as interesting, and as smooth. Thank you very much.